Welcome. Today's Big Thinking event will be delivered in English. French simultaneous interpretation is available. This service is accessible through your cell phone by calling 1-866-261-6767 and using participant code 585303#. The event will begin shortly. Thank you.
Bienvenue. La conférence Voir grand d'aujourd'hui se tiendra en anglais. L'interprétation simultanée en français est disponible. Ce service est accessible par téléphone mobile au 1-866-261-6767 avec le code participant 585303 #. L'événement débutera sous peu. Merci.
Good afternoon and welcome to Big Thinking. Bon après-midi et bienvenue à notre série de causeries Voir grand. I'm Gabriel Miller, the President and CEO of the Federation for the Humanities and Social Sciences. We're the national voice for over 90,000 scholars, and our membership comprises over 160 universities and scholarly associations. Today's event will take place in English, with simultaneous interpretation in French. L'événement d'aujourd'hui se déroule en anglais avec interprétation simultanée en français. To begin, I want to acknowledge that the Federation office and most of our staff are located on unceded traditional territory of the Algonquin Anishinaabe Nation. Audience members are participating from across the country, and so we extend our respect to all First Nations, Inuit, and Métis peoples for their valuable past and present contributions to this land. This is the Federation's first virtual Big Thinking on the Hill, and we are very excited to be exploring this new format with all of you. We're committed to creating opportunities for researchers to challenge and inspire policymakers, citizens, researchers, the media, and community members on the critical questions of our time. Over 500 people have registered for today's event, which speaks to the importance and timeliness of exploring our future digital lives. A few notes before we begin. After Dr. Pedersen's talk, we'll move into a moderated question and answer session before taking some of your questions. To submit a question, please type it into the chat box. We'll begin monitoring the box for audience questions during the moderated Q&A portion of the event, so a little later. I want to thank our friends and partners at the Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council for their continued support of Big Thinking. And I also want to acknowledge the support of Big Thinking's parliamentary sponsor and very good friend, Mr. Greg Fergus, MP for Hull Elmer, and Parliamentary Secretary to the President of the Treasury Board and to the Minister of Digital Government. I'd now like to ask Mr. Fergus to introduce today's speaker.
Well, thank you very much, Gabriel, and thank you for, all for being here today and for participating. And I'd like to thank the over 500 people who are joining us online to watch this, I think, a really important discussion. This places this forum that the Big Thinking series that the Federation of Humanities and Social Sciences puts together every month or so on the Hill is such an important forum, and I'm really pleased to have been associated with it now since my election in 2015. My history with the Federation goes back a lot longer than that, when I used to work for what was known at the time, the Association of Universities and Colleges of Canada. And the Big Thinking series on the Hill was always an important event for people to go to participate in, to learn more about our world and the deep thinking which is going on of the consequences of some of the actions that we're taking. This is really important for policymakers, and one which I'm pleased to see that is even more popular online with this first virtual session of the Big Thinking series. Today's discussion, of course, with Dr. Isabel Pedersen is going to be exciting, and it's a very important discussion, one which is relevant, I think, to all of us in more ways, as she'll demonstrate, in more ways than we realize. It's also important to me as Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister for Digital Government for us to have a better understanding of what is going on. Now, I won't be able to stay with the entire proceedings today because I'm supposed to be participating on the virtual parliament, which is happening at this time. So I will be watching it later on tonight, en différé, comme on dit en français, and it will give me an opportunity to understand a lot more clearly the implications of what Dr. Pedersen is going to be doing. So without further ado, let me take advantage of this opportunity to introduce Dr. Pedersen. Dr. Isabel Pedersen is Canada Research Chair in Digital Life, Media and Culture, and Associate Professor at Ontario Tech University. She is co-editor of Embodied Computing, Wearables, Implantables, Embeddables, Ingestibles, a collection of essays that is going to be released this spring by MIT Press. As a humanities researcher, Isabel explores how technology is invented and adopted. She takes a human-centric approach to understanding the impact on life, culture, politics, art, ethics, and social practices. She was inducted into the Royal Society of Canada's College of New Scholars, Artists, and Scientists in 2014, and she is here with us today. So without further ado, it gives me great pleasure to introduce to you Dr. Isabel Pedersen.
Thank you very much, Mr. Greg Fergus and the Federation for such a kind introduction. Today, I want to talk about an emergent technology, one that involves networked bodies, a new paradigm that is taking shape in science and technology, research and development that I think our community, it requires our attention now in the social sciences and humanities. The broader research area for it is called by many names, but one of them is the Internet of Bodies that describes a technology that will integrate lives and our bodily data much more closely with the internet, if you can imagine that. Toward the end of my talk, I'm going to introduce a specific technology called a body network, which is one of the major threshold technologies behind the conceptual idea. But I'm going to linger over the history first. My talk is not about COVID-19, but COVID-19 throws some of these ideas into sharp focus and even urgency. I drafted this talk as I saw governments around the world begin to use devices to track people moving through spaces, to predict if the spread of the virus would get worse, or to help diagnose it using the embodied technologies that I've been really watching for years. My big thinking theme is that we need to meet the exponential speed of technology innovation with much longer projections and much more anticipation for the consequences in order to mitigate the significant imposition of tech that's made upon us. Technology is really outpacing policymakers. For AI advancement in particular, we need to acknowledge the notion of an AI literacy as a means for civic engagement. And I'm working along those lines for a new book with my collaborator, Dr. Anne Hill-Dune at the University of Minnesota. I can add that the federal government's dedication to research in this area is strong. Policy Horizons Canada takes a foresight approach to emergent technology and other disruptive change, aligning it with federal funding, which is so important. Artificial intelligence, now a global industry, has changed computing paradigms in every sector, including those technologies that are worn on and implanted in people's bodies. Artificial intelligence will not only propel the technology farther than anything we can actually imagine, it will be used to justify adopting the tech before we think about the implications. Canada has been at the forefront of establishing a human-centric vision for AI with the Pan-Canadian Artificial Intelligence Strategy that was launched in 2017. Some of you might be directly involved in Canada's roadmap for AI to spur economic growth. However, I think all of us need to think about AI and the human rights implications that it instigates and challenges. In particular, we need to think about human agency, creativity, social connection, social values, economics and digital divide, AI bias and discrimination, and the need for regulations as we move forward with a notion of human enhancement, and one that's should be human-centric. And we need to foster the idea of AI literacy for developers, citizens, and stakeholders that includes social implications. I want to go back in time and look at a forecast that was made in the year 2009 in Popular Science magazine. Intel wants brain implants in customers' heads by 2020. A forecast like this one was actually never questioned back in 2009 by a government or a school board or a cultural institute for the kinds of impact it might have on us now. It was really celebrated or dismissed as sensationalism or technoliberalism on the part of big tech. But this is big business now. This example helps me convey my approach to understanding future digital life. I draw on rhetorical studies and humanities methodologies to understand technological advancement and future projections. Invention, adoption, and adaptation to tech occur through acts of persuasion, performance, and manipulation, which go on constantly in public discourses when there are no users yet to study. This is especially true of the language of forecasting or predicting how our digital lives will unfold, and even more so with AI. AI is treated as a global race that all of us are required to run. Speeding and getting to AI innovation is often valued more than the quality or maintaining human rights. The dramatic rhetorical justifications for using technology now to solve COVID-19 will be discussed for years after. Speed orders and justifies actions and throws our previous value systems into chaos. The research behind today's talk spans 2 books. My first solo authored book, Readytowear, A Rhetoric of Wearable Computers and Reality Shifting Media, back in 2013, and now Embodied Computing, a co-edited collection just released by MIT Press. The first one was about reading into predictions of technologies made by inventors as technocultural imaginaries. It took up the idea that predictions about computing had to be challenged to determine where the motives were actually coming from and to whose benefit. At that time, I named the term continuum of embodiment to explore how inventions discussed in public discourses promoted the way that mobile technology would evolve to become wearable, a process which would then lay the groundwork and expectations for implantable technology. In many ways, this discourse framed a seemingly imminent outcome of progress that was powerful. It grew from corporate advertising in the post-millennial era that made our tech adoption to mobile phones and eventually Fitbits and GoPro cameras seem imminent long before any of them actually emerged into products. I argued that this rhetoric of imminence was ameliorative. We imagined tech would always improve us and better our situation, all in the name of imminent progress, which is a ruse. Yet I also argued that tech adoption and device adoption was more about technogenesis, following N. Catherine Hales, that complex constellations of transhumanism, conditions of surveillance, tech advancements, militaristic drive, political economic hierarchies, Hollywood heroes, and so many other factors also drove this rhetoric of imminence. Now, the production of consumer wearables proliferates at an astounding rate. This chart shows the progression from nearly no sales, you can see in 2014, to 6 years later, more than 75 million units are shipped every quarter. However, the justifications for much more invasive technology are undergoing emergence because the body is increasingly seen as a data platform, the next frontier to colonize. And let me unpack that idea a little bit more. The new collection called Embodied Computing, just one slide back, please. Thank you. The new collection called Embodied Computing features the writers of engineers, artists, and sociologists who present a more diverse explanation of the phenomena. Along with my co-editor, Dr. Andrew Iliadis, who's at Temple University, we define embodied computing as including computer components, which are carried, worn, implanted, ingested, or engaging in ambient interaction with the body. Bodies become data providers for AI algorithms and the companies that want that data. This model offers ways to disclose how socio-technical assemblages instigate cultural responses, which in turn may reveal harm or bias, marginalization, or other ethical concerns. For instance, you can see the decreasing level of human agency left to right across the continuum. People choose to carry a smartphone and use it, and in some cases are required to use them for work, for example, but you have little or no control on the other side with ambient tech and ambient intelligence. If a building uses remote facial recognition cameras and biometric sensors to identify you, you're simply objectified by them. We've heard a lot about contact tracing for COVID-19. On April 10th, Apple and Google announced plans to work together. As The Economist pointed out, and I quote, "These two firms exert varying degrees of control over almost every operational smartphone on Earth," end quote. In democratic nations, people will be asked to carry a phone so that authorities can track who comes into contact with whom. Human rights issues over control of one's data come to the fore. But this is playing out differently in every country facing the pandemic. Our beliefs about saving lives alters our confidence and skepticism over big tech and what our governments should be allowed to do. It comes down to human agency. What about the other side of the continuum with ambient tech and ambient intelligence, technology that surrounds people? Ambient computing is controlled by external actors, companies and governments now. This is a photo that was taken by Reuters on March 6th. A software developer in Beijing is developing facial recognition software to identify the faces of people wearing masks during the outbreak of coronavirus. For me, this signals that very little citizen control over data or AI algorithms exists in this scenario. But thermal cameras are monitoring our biodata as well, and there are temperature checks for in-person shopping, and this seemed to happen to us overnight. This is a concept illustration of people being monitored coming off an airplane with their temperature showing. Ambient computing is being normalized as a means to track the virus, and we have to think about that and the unintended consequences of profiling people during this crisis. I want to segue now to the idea of a body network for the Internet of Bodies concept, which might seem radical, but it falls in line with the continuum I have been discussing because it provides data collectors more access to us. A body network unifies all three of these categories to envelop the user in a much more direct connection with the Internet, providing data. But it's also an imaginary forecast made for us, as well as constituting tech under adoption and development all over the world. It will provide data for AI training and for platforms for external companies who will promote the Internet of Bodies in a manner similar to the Internet of Things. And the tech is very challenging. It involves an advanced Wi-Fi standard that lets data travel through the body as well as over the body. In this mock-up from 2013, you can see the network working internally through implants, first working internally through implants, communicating with each other, then sending data to wearables on the surface of the body, and finally the data is sent outward to the cloud. To follow its emergence, I sampled 1,900 technical papers and books sourced through the ACM Digital Library that describe different variations of this tech. And very, very little of it appears in our public discourses at the moment, so it doesn't really receive public scrutiny yet. Still in the prototyping stages, body networks will connect and make fractured activities and events seem more seamless or behave more seamlessly, more efficiently. They will provide a means to connect implanted devices to each other and to the Internet directly for medical health and medical reasons, but it's being imagined for all kinds of other activities. To do the research, I also looked at the original working group notes that started back in 2006 to establish the Wireless Personal Area Network engineering standard. This international group believed that applications would, and I quote, include body automation, medical monitoring, an evolutionary set of healthcare services, medical implants, smart pills, assistance to people with disability, motion and gait tracking, security, and even entertainment, end quote. And this team believed that the BAN market, so BAN is body area network market, would potentially have hundreds of millions of devices that it could connect. So for my research, the projections will appear in small references buried in these tech descriptions. While medical monitoring is always present, it's always the first application, body networks are imagined for things like sports performance monitoring, gaming, mass event management, social networking, which are embedded in these kinds of quotes. And they all appear as forecasts, right? I'm really mostly interested in this grand vision to transform everyday life in the future for all of us. One of the unique features, and I said this before, is that intra-body communication uses electromagnetic wave signals, and it uses the body itself as a communication medium. It means that devices send signals to each other inside the body. So with cognitive brain interaction, this tech could datafy your feelings, your emotions, your thoughts for big tech, for big business and other platforms, revealing your very personal information. But on the flip side, which is more positive, or let's say could change a whole other sector, intra-body communication could be used to prevent identity theft by passive continuous authentication of your brainwaves, which is much safer than the kinds of methods we use today. Look at this image of a body network being used for remote patient monitoring back in 2016. I don't want to get caught up in the technology descriptions, and I can't speak to development of sophisticated medical monitoring, but this illustrates a vision, right? A grand vision for the future. It illustrates how a data provider, a person at home in layer 1, is being monitored. Layer 2 involves personal tech, so your cell phone, your laptop computer serving this complete system. Layer 3 is the black box. It illustrates decision-making algorithms for data users. And layer 4 involves external actors, so doctors, hospitals. But this could also include insurance companies, governments, corporations. This image is presented as if it's a reality when it isn't yet. This is just a forecast. I included this image in my book, but it now takes on new implications and new rhetorical motives when it's contextualized by COVID-19, if it could become a platform. And we can all imagine how this would change things. And for the most part, the most recent applications for body networks are very much enmeshed in e-health, big data, and internet computing contexts like IoT. This recent Wall Street Journal article raises key issues and raises the point that it will be very difficult to regulate. And it presents issues from different regulatory points of view. One notes, and I quote, that existing IOB, so existing Internet of Bodies companies, rely on end user license agreements and privacy policies to retain rights in software and to create rights to monitor, aggregate, and share users' bodily data. But this author points out that we can't responsibly use the same data governance model for intra-body devices that we use, say, for fitness trackers. Further, in a recent journal article, these authors point out much more directly, the Internet of Bodies exposes us to unprecedented privacy and cybersecurity vulnerabilities. They position it amid AI adoption, automation, and other advancement, and look to responsible AI and social values as the salve to correct it. So I believe that body networks will intensify our lack of agency and our lack of human control over AI algorithms. Information exchange now goes on without providing people the opportunity to grasp the exchange, follow it, or understand it, much less control it. This intensifies the need for AI transparency. Policy will need to dig deeper into the prototyping stages to presuppose the implied outcomes through R&D, not after the fact. AI decision-making has proven to discriminate in terms of socioeconomic position, gender, race, and persons with disabilities. And I'm going to quote West, Whitaker, and Crawford. By tracing the way in which race, gender, and other identities are understood, represented, and reflected, both within AI systems and in the contexts where they are applied, we can begin to see the bigger picture, one that acknowledges power relationships, and centers equality and justice, end quote. I remind myself and us that body networks will significantly recontextualize AI systems, and we need to confront inequity at this moment. I step back and I offer this fun forecast about digital telepathy by Mark Zuckerberg, CEO of Facebook. One day, I believe we'll be able to send full, rich thoughts to each other directly using technology. And he said this in 2015. We already know that large corporations are treated as autonomous powers because they are funding and developing AI algorithms, platforms, and infrastructure for disruptive tech like this. By the time governments respond, corporations have solidified business practices, and they have also solidified a worldview that's really difficult for all of us to alter. At my lab, we watched this concept evolve in public discourse with news, first published in 2007. We also traced it back to the 80s to find cultural references, novels, films, and television shows that inform what Mr. Zuckerberg is saying today. He knows that it has to be embedded in culture to support his grand vision, his forecast, and the narratives that people will engage in it in order to adopt it and adapt to it. And we're beginning to cross-reference the fact that this kind of brain-computer interaction would need a sophisticated body network to actually work. A body network is not that significant on its own, but it signifies a threshold to dramatically different computing paradigm emerging over the next 20 to 30 years. I offered this example as a takeaway. We need to confront human and cultural implications at much earlier points in tech emergence by looking at culture, public discourse, and the imaginaries formed around tech. Who will be marginalized? Who will be left behind in the digital divide? How will AI techniques magnify impacts? We need to develop a long game. My big thinking theme today is that the exponential speed of technology innovation needs longer projections to meet a much broader, varied set of consequences that could happen to humans. And we need to develop a truly human-centric vision from the get-go. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Isabel. And I don't just want to thank you for the talk you've just given, but just for the work and the passion that you've put into preparing for today. I've had the chance to speak with you 3 or 4 times preparing for today, and I've just been struck by the insight, but also the commitment to these conversations that you so clearly bring to it. And it's a great and I think important start to bringing these lectures online. I want to start. We're going to take a few questions that we had put together ahead of time, and then we're going to take some questions from the audience, and people can type those questions into the chat box on their screen, as I mentioned earlier. But first of all, I want to touch on something that you did speak a little bit about in your presentation, but I think it's so important and so prominent now that it's worth talking a little bit more about. You know, I think the current crisis has revealed a few areas where we're going to have a lot of reflecting to do and some reforming to do. And the ones that jump out to me first, our ability and our commitment to protecting the most vulnerable people in our society, but also considering the impacts on equity for marginalized people, not just in public health, but in the options and the solutions that we introduce during the course of a crisis like this. For marginalized people, for racialized people, for disabled people, what do you see as being the issues specific to those folks in this conversation? And are those discussions, or where are those discussions happening?
So thank you for inviting me, and I really also enjoyed working on this talk with you and thinking of the big picture, bringing my research into that kind of much more sort of more focused approach. I think the biggest problem is they're not being brought into the conversation, right? They're being left out of some of it. Sometimes science and technology development goes on without hearing the voices of social science and humanities, let's say, input, and the voices of people who are experiencing marginalization on different levels. I mean, there is the principle of co-design, right? That you're not meant to develop technology for populations without including everybody, without including sort of a much more inclusive approach to hearing the problems and issues from the start rather than after the fact. So I think that has been going on. And so I believe that what we have to do is bring these voices into the very beginning, the starting point, right? At the prototyping stages, or even at the sort of visioning stages, when we imagine a new technology, ask who's going to be left out of this conversation, or who's going to risk being further marginalized by it. And I think the community, the AI ethics community, is turning to understanding these issues in terms of human rights, right? There's a great deal to read on how there are a lot of organizations that are starting to ask, are these going to affect people's human rights? And I like the IEEE ethically aligned design mandate, that it's starting to ask those questions and ask developers to think about human rights from the beginning.
Thank you very much for that. You know, it's there's lots to be scared of in this subject matter, and not least of which is the quote from Mark Zuckerberg that sent a chill up my back. But I think it's also important for us to think a little bit about ways that properly used some of these advances might benefit us. Am I right that there are benefits here, and if so, which ones are you seeing as being kind of the most important?
So, my research is about how we're, much less at the specific application level and trying to understand how we're basically adopting a completely new paradigm for computing, right? So it has that. So those 1900 articles, however, reference very specific aspects of the technology that are being brought together by this idea of a body area network. So in terms of medical innovation, certainly there's a great deal that is going to, I think, be positive. And it's spoken about in terms of monitoring, diagnosis, and therapy. So all aspects of health, are being targeted under this umbrella. And I think the most dramatic innovation is remote monitoring of vital signs. So that the premise is that people at home will be able to be monitored if they have a certain health condition or medical condition. It will be much more closely monitored than the paradigm we see now. So, and I think when you think of vital signs are, reference our health condition or medical condition, but they also speak to our emotional life, our emotional output, our emotional biofeedback, our thoughts, our feelings, are we nervous, are we not? So you can imagine what could happen if you could be monitored according to your emotional feedback and output. So, but specifically, I see papers on body sports monitoring, right? That we're tracking how athletes, or propose to track that sort of in real time. Or for example, I read one about correcting posture with implanted sensors. So if you have tiny implanted sensors, you could constantly, you could help your, you could correct posture, you could develop sort of better, let's say, wellness will be re-envisioned in a different way. And I also saw a very interesting one about insomnia and sleep disorders. So imagine if you had those conditions, instead of going to a clinic and sleeping overnight there and being monitored, you would be monitored in your own home, in your own, your own life world. And that, I think, will change things. And I'll just add that one of the other areas that is communication, right? So this idea and this sort of, that you'll be able to pass communication by touching other people, right? So data can be passed through through a handshake or a touch on the shoulder. And I don't think we've ever experienced anything like that. So these are the big
Yeah.
visionary aspects to it.
No, what strikes me now is the same thing that struck me when I first saw your presentation, which is some of the things you're talking about are just even challenging our imagination, in terms of what we thought was possible or what we were aware of going on. I think I'm going to give you one more of our questions, and then we should be able to take some from the audience. So I think I'm going to, for the last question from us, you've put a lot of emphasis on, at least to my mind, the way we talk about these issues or the way we don't talk about them as a society. And so part of what I think I'll take away from this is kind of a call to policymakers and to government leaders about the conversations we need to be having. I want to be sure, are you saying that policymakers need to be leading that kind of public conversation about the Internet of bodies? And if yes, who else needs to be involved?
So I'm thrilled that policymakers are interested in listening. I think for this talk, I use the term Internet of Bodies because it's the most descriptive metaphor for what is really a broad movement to bring bodies into cloud computing or into the internet. And those terms will probably change dramatically over time and seem dated. By the time this actually happens, Internet of Bodies won't be the word we'll use. So I think what I'm saying is that the same way that large cities plan for demographic changes, and that I think we need to also accommodate for mass digital cultural change in the same way that we do that kind of planning. So we think ahead when it comes to education. We plan for our citizens to be formally educated for 20 years and possibly even more. So I think that in our expectation for how we will live in the sort of near future has to be brought into much more planning for policy than I think we have been doing. And I'm not a policy expert at all, but I think the projections need to be sort of 30 to 50 years out to chart the effect on digital life and digital culture. I mean, if we could go back to the late 90s and ask these kinds of questions about the internet we have now, I think we would. And we would have a lot to say about how to shape the future in terms of citizen engagement, social implications, ethics, regulations that we're scrambling to catch up with. So I think research, planning, and policy need to have sort of a longer projection when it comes to digital culture.
Okay, so thanks, Isabel. So here's our first question or group of questions from the audience, and my colleagues have tried to group a few of these together. So here's the first one. What kind of ethics framework do you use or plan to use to evaluate acceptable ethics in extreme situations that can affect public health or that have effects that unsettle our values? So I'm not sure how formal you'd answer the question, but I guess if there's an ethical framework, or how do you approach those ethical questions in extreme situations like the one we're in now?
Well, it's kind of a two-part that you asked me, what is your ethical framework? And I've had the great privilege to teach Masters in Computer Science, a course in AI ethics. And I've done that since January. And so what I was able to do was really come up with a framework for ethically aligned design, which is this idea that we think about ethics or value systems, human rights at the start of innovation, right? When you have a big idea, when you're starting to think about something. So, and what I used for that were a combination of, looking at UN documents, looking at conventions put out by multinational organizations, and Canada's vision for AI, which, as I said, is strong, right? In this country, we have a very good strategy for AI. So I'm trying to get around to the idea that we need to be assuming this ahead of time right? That we need to be assuming, and it's difficult in the middle of a pandemic to say that we should have thought of this ahead of time, but I'm saying that we need to think of it. We need to plan. I think the best strategy is to have to plan ahead. And ethically aligned design, we brought it down to 8 principles. And my students and I, and they are writing AI algorithms, right? They're working in that field, or they're working in those. They will be working in those businesses. So it was great to ask them, what do you think about AI bias and discrimination? And look at these case studies where people were discriminated against using certain AI platforms. And what would you do differently as a developer? And how would you bring in this process to prevent that kind of outcome? So about COVID and the idea that we're in crisis, I think the best thing we can do is, again, have as much planning ahead of time that we can possibly put into place.
Let's turn to a few questions about education, which is a natural for our audience. When we look at these technologies, AI and others that you've talked about today, and the implications for education, whether it's higher education or whether it's K to 12, what implications do you see there, and where do we need to be turning our attention?
So I think back to the course of my own research. So I started to think about wearable technologies this is 1999, right? When no one else was really talking about it except for certain research houses around the world. And as a social scientist and a humanities researcher, I realized that we needed to understand at that point, what is the motive behind the technologies and why people want to use them and what they're going to be for. This always asking, how will this affect people in the future? What will it be for, and to whose benefit and to whose loss? And so I think this idea of AI literacy I talked about in my formal talk is really a subset of the notion of a digital literacy, right? So we've used that term for a long time, and it's been around for a long time, and there are researchers all over the world working on digital literacy. And the idea that that has to be cross-referenced between a notion of civic engagement as well as education, right? So we want to teach students and student developers to understand what the social implications for AI are in school, but then we want them to evolve into civically engaged citizens that understand human rights, that understand what the impact will be to the kinds of things they are creating and making. So I believe that we need to invest a little bit more into sort of a literacy around AI. And that is not an argument that we shouldn't also be regulating AI, which I believe we should be writing policies, governments should be working on that. But I think we need to have citizens engaged in this idea. And I can add that the government of Finland has launched a course for its citizens. Its goal it's called Elements of AI, and its goal is to get 1% of its citizens understanding the basic elements of AI in order to be civically engaged. So I thought that was an interesting example for the notion of educating a population.
I think we have time for one more question before we wrap up, Isabel. And first of all, I just want to say we're getting a lot of really great questions, and I just want to thank everyone who submitted them. We might need to leave more time in the future for your questions at home. So I have the unenviable task of choosing a last question here. I think I'd like to pick up again on some of your comments around marginalized communities. Here's the question: what role could banned technologies play in the identification of marginalized communities and their health well-being, and how could that drive policy decisions and social service delivery? So for me, when I heard you speaking, the thing that leapt to mind when you were talking about monitoring, remote health monitoring, you think of people in northern or remote communities, for instance. Is that the best example, or are there others that you feel like we really could be exploring in terms of better serving people who need the most better service and support.
I think I did talk about social implications a great deal, and I do want to add that the researchers working on body area networks are very concerned with bettering the lives and health of people. And they, for example, monitoring diabetes is one of the ones that is often mentioned and often discussed in these technical papers, which might be about power, or how to make sure that the technology that works and that it's safe, and those kinds of things. So the body area network movement is, I'm going to say, geared to helping people live better, have better lives. I think that and right in the early the early writing about it, they mentioned bettering the lives of persons with disabilities. That was in there. And one of the original pioneers himself was suffering for a decade with cancer, and he saw this as a means. He was certainly discussed his own motivation for health, for his health, and how this could help others in his situation in the future. So I think that that will be important. And I know that other applications, for example, are trying to come up with different ways to help. I have an example of hearing and visually impaired persons that they're using haptic devices to use other senses to help people who might want to, in terms of wayfinding and navigation. So there are many, many examples of technologies that can help marginalized people in those categories. But I think we have to always bring back the notion of co-design. It has to be done with the persons from these groups who are involved in the design, who are, have a voice from the start and not after the fact.
Well, Dr. Isabel Pedersen, I just want to thank you for today's talk. It's been an exercise in co-design. I would say certainly our team, and I'm grateful to them, to everyone on our events team and our policy team and our communications team who took this adventure with you. And of course, it's come together in a way that never would have been possible without your involvement and your research and your passion. We're grateful for your involvement today. Thank you so much. And also, before we sign off, thank you to our dear friends at the Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council, and again, our sponsor, Greg Fergus, and to all of our members and supporters and partners across the country who have continued to be involved in the work of the Federation through this very unusual and challenging time, and have shown such interest in participating in today's lecture. Thank you so much. Be well. Au revoir. Merci beaucoup.
Thank you, Gabriel.